lecture in the 53rd series of the Hamilton Hall Lectures. I want to tell you that downstairs in the hallway there is a sheet of paper on which we'd like you to write the names of any friends who might be interested in coming to the lectures next year. That is the year 2000. As many of you probably realize, our last two lectures have been videotaped for local television showing. And we are on camera again this morning, as a matter of fact. Those of you who live in Salem will be able to view last week's speaker, Farrah Courtney, on March 15th at 8 o'clock, or March 22nd at 8 o'clock, or March 28th at 7:30. We hope to make these tapes available to cable stations in other North Shore communities as well. This morning we welcome a familiar face, Dr. Jorge Dominguez, who is the director of the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. He is also the Clarence Dillon Professor of International Affairs at Harvard University. He received his BA at Yale and his MA and PhD from Harvard. Professor Dominguez was editor for a television series called Crisis in Central America, a 4-part special report for Frontline, Public Broadcasting System, in 1985. The 4 parts were entitled The Yankee Years, Castro's Challenge, Revolution in Nicaragua, and Battle for El Salvador. For this, he won the Peabody Award. In 1988, he was the chief editorial advisor for Mexico, also on public broadcasting. This series included Revolution, From Boom to Bust, and End of an Era. He is a member of several editorial boards and a contributing editor to Foreign Policy. He is a member of the Inter-American Dialogue, Council on Foreign Relations. Dr. Dominguez has contributed to the publication of many books on Latin America and the Caribbean as editor or co-editor and as chapter author. The latest of these books is titled Toward Mexico's Democratization, Parties, Campaigns, Elections, and Public Opinion, published this year. I'm delighted to present Professor Dominguez, whose very timely subject is Democracy and Markets in Latin America.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be with you one more time in this series to talk a bit, generally, not about one particular country, but really about the theme, the relationship between democratic politics on the one hand and market economies on the other. I'll be talking about it with regard to Latin American countries, but this is a subject that is not unique to any part of the world's geography. Among the most noteworthy thinkers who in some way or another shaped the ideas for the world in which we live, Karl Marx, Alexis de Tocqueville, John Stuart Mill, they disagreed on many topics, but they agreed on one. The one was that democracy and market, democracy and capitalism, as they would use that word, would not go together. That you could have one or the other. But if you had one, it would undermine the other. For Marx in particular, it meant that if you had full-blown capitalism, you would not be able to have democratic practices and procedures. Tocqueville and Mill wondered any ways in which liberty, and particularly economic freedom, innovation, and entrepreneurship could survive the onslaught of majoritarian passions. In the late 20th century, certainly in the experience of the United States, we assume that democracy and markets go together. What is interesting about the Latin American experience is that that question has been vigorously debated, as vigorously debated as in the United States and Western Europe in the middle of the 19th century, so too it is still vigorously debated today. And that's the set of issues that I want to address, issues of widespread, long-standing significance that assume that the word democratic popularity and the word fiscal prudence could never be uttered in the same sentence. If we were having this conversation 25 years ago, sometime in the early to mid-1970s, and we looked at Latin American countries, many of us, certainly a great many Latin Americans at the time, reached the same conclusion that I recalled for you in terms of the thinking of Marx, de Tocqueville, and Mill. Namely, that you could either have democracy or you could have a market economy, but you could not have both. And the reason many of them came to that set of beliefs is that a wide variety of democratic governments in Latin America had performed terribly with regard to the management of the economy, of the design of institutions that could foster economic growth. In the early to mid-19th century, in Chile, under democratic government, the inflation rate reached about 500% per year. In Argentina, being slightly more competitive, it reached about 1,000% per year. I mention only these two numbers not because they were the only problems in these two countries, but because they're illustrative of a wide array of problems, a wide array of instances of severe economic disarray. Moreover, these were not just concerns for the wealthy, these were not just concerns for those who would look up the newspaper to read up these numbers, but it was very clear that the lives of ordinary people, the lives of very poor people, on behalf of whom a number of these democratic politicians ran for office and claimed to be governing, the lives of the poor were suffering as well. That real wages of ordinary workers, whether in the agriculture or in industry, were plummeting as a consequence of these policies. And so in that period, the period of the early to mid-1970s, you have the emergence of authoritarian regimes throughout most of Latin America. Because a great many people believed, reluctantly in most cases, that they could no longer afford democratic practices if that's what it meant. That it was more important, a great many of them believed, to shore up economic procedures, practices, institutions in order to generate economic growth and later worry about democracy. What occurred as the years continued to pass is that 10 years later, by the early to mid-1980s, citizens in the regions and many observers realized that it looked as if Latin Americans believed in equal opportunity ineptitude. That it was true that democratic governments had been inept, but it turned out to be just about equally true that dictatorships were inept. Indeed, the region goes through a period of time under authoritarian regime that marks an economic depression, a series of successive and related deep economic crises, as grave, as severe, as the world suffered in the 1930s. Latin America really had two great depressions during the 20th century. One shared with the United States and other countries in the 1930s. The other one very much limited to Latin America and Africa in the 1980s. As the economies of the United States and Europe boomed in the 1980s, the economies of East Asian countries more than boomed in the 1980s. Latin America and Sub-Saharan Africa lagged behind and, in fact, declined. There are a number of reasons why it occurred. I don't want to spend too much time on that, but I do want to recall at least one example that is usually cited as a counterexample to what I just said, that authoritarian regimes performed poorly in the management of the economy. And that is the case of Chile in the dictatorship of General Augusto Pinochet, who governed Chile from 1973 and reached power by military coup until 1990, early 1990, and who now sits in London awaiting the possibility that he might be extradited for criminal trials. It is often said that Pinochet may have been a harsh dictator under whom a great many abuses were committed, but that he was a fine manager of the Chilean economy. And I think it's important to put that in perspective. It is true that the worst instance of mismanagement in Chilean 20th century history with regard to the economy occurred under the government of President Salvador Allende in the early 1970s, whom General Pinochet overthrew. So as compared to his predecessor, there is no question that Pinochet was a better economic manager. But ask a couple of different questions, particularly in a more general context of trying to think through this set of issues. One could be, one of the arguments on behalf of the efficacy of dictatorships to manage the economy is that in a crisis, when Democrats may dither, when politicians may need to consult with each other, dictators can act with decisiveness. They can act with the speed, with the force, if necessary, that is appropriate to grave circumstances. This Great Depression that hit Latin America in the 1980s more or less began with something called the debt crisis. The debt crisis began in Mexico, spread throughout the region, and in a relatively short period of time there was a threat both to international financial institutions, private and public, and certainly to these countries as a whole. How then did General Pinochet, the dictator of Chile at the time, 1982-83, how did he cope with this crisis? Well, he coped no better than anybody else. In fact, in that period, that key period of 1982-83, the gross domestic product of the Chilean economy dropped more rapidly. It dropped by a much larger proportion, by 12% in 1 year, than any of the other Latin American economies of similar size. Not only was this dictator no more effective, but in fact, Chile under him, at that moment of grave crisis, was the worst performer. But one could say, well, the argument on behalf of dictatorship may not be that. The argument on behalf of dictatorship is it can give you, certainly in the case of someone who governed for 17 years, a long period of stability so that you can create the circumstances whereby the economy can grow. Well, in the 1980s, the growth rate for the Chilean economy, gross domestic product per capita, was 1% per year. 1% per year is better than zero. 1% per year is better than some of the other Latin American countries did. But 1% per year is nothing to get very excited about. It is certainly nothing to get excited about by the standards of the East Asian countries at the time. But even in Latin America, countries under constitutional government, and there had not been very many, as I said before, because dictatorships had become the dominant norm. Countries under constitutional government in the 1980s, Colombia and Costa Rica, performed better than the Chilean economic growth rate in the 1980s. General Pinochet was in fact responsible above all for a miracle. It was a miracle in public relations. It was a miracle in persuading the editorial page of the Wall Street Journal and the London Economist and the New York Times and many other elite newspapers in the world that he had brought about in Chile what he had not, which was good, sound, and effective economic management. Why? Why is it that this performance of dictatorships was not better? Or why is it, to return to the broad theme of my remarks this morning, why is it that democracy is, in Latin America, no worse than dictatorships in managing the economy or in mismanaging the economy? And why is it that as we moved from the 1970s through the 1980s through the 1990s, an argument can be made today that democracy may have a number of important advantages in fostering not only a market economy but economic growth, and that democracy may have these kinds of advantages not just in the abstract as an exercise in logic, but in fact in practice, that some Latin American countries under constitutional government are in fact doing much better than they had in the past. I want to move to that set of remarks first. However, let me say a few words of a more general nature. What are some examples? What are some ways to think that democracy might contribute to economic growth and in Latin America, and why is it that there has been a change from the 1970s to the 1990s? First, the change. The change actually, I think, in itself is both instructive and hopeful. Under terrible conditions of dictatorship in politics and in society on the one hand, and really awful economic performance on the other, people learn. How did they learn? Democrats who many of whom had been responsible for the terrible mismanagement of the economy, began to understand more clearly the costs of their misbehavior, began to understand more clearly that if they truly believed in democratic politics, that if they believed in political freedoms, they had to change the way that they thought about the economy. They had to begin to understand and to act credibly on the proposition that they could not, as so many of them had in the past, believed in the view that the government should micromanage the economy, that the key decisions in economic activity should be run from the presidency or from economic agencies, that the commanding heights of the economy should be owned not by ordinary citizens or private firms, but by state enterprises and the national government. And so you begin to have, on the center and the left of the political system, in country after country in Latin America, a major change in thinking about the economy. And you see it among former guerrillas in El Salvador, you see it among former socialists in Chile, you see it as you go from one country to another. And a major continent-wide transformation in thinking about the economy on the political center and in the political left. Among many of those who had supported dictatorships, particularly those who had supported dictatorship reluctantly, not because they loved the boot of a military officer, but because they thought it was the lesser evil, given the problems that the region had changed. They began to think a little more carefully about the nature of the beliefs that they held. Many of them thought that freedom was undifferentiated. Many of them thought deeply and cared profoundly about the importance of economic freedom, the freedom for economic innovation, for risk-taking, for entrepreneurship. But they also believed that that set of economic freedoms should indeed be the foundation of political and democratic freedoms. And under these dictatorships, they were getting neither economic growth nor any other kinds of freedoms. And so on the political right, and particularly in the business community of many of these countries, there began to be greater credence to the proposition that even for the sake of markets, there ought to be political freedom as well. And why? Because it turned out not only that the dictators were inept, but they often were arbitrary. They often believed just as much as any communist did in the importance of having the economy run by state enterprises, headed by a military officer, to be sure. But if that turned out to be the only difference, that you would not be able to compete in your own private firm because you were competing against a state enterprise now headed by a general, then somehow the benefits of dictatorship for advancement of a market economy vanished. So on the right and on the left, you began to see a very significant movement. You began to see it among labor union leaders and among business executives. Ways to rethink the nature of politics and markets. Ways to rethink the connection between the form of political regime and the form of the economic regime. And then there was, just in case that was not enough, the great economic catastrophe of the 1980s. How is it that you come out of it? It is that learning, that slow collective learning that took about 20 years, that it's an important part of the explanation. What about the logic? What are some propositions that suggest that democracy might in fact be helpful for a market economy. They're really not very complicated ideas. They're fairly straightforward, but they're worth remembering. One proposition is that democracies provide for a fairly reliable means, peacefully, to get rid of people who have done a bad job. Probably over the past couple of years, one very straightforward example of this doesn't come from Latin America. It comes from East Asia. At approximately the same time in 1997, Indonesia and South Korea went through a severe financial crisis, an economic panic. They were not the only ones. I don't want to go too far away from my topic today. I just want to illustrate the point. If you look at it today, Indonesia remains in very severe difficulties, and South Korea has done far better. And there is, in fact, a very straightforward reason. South Korea had an election, Indonesia did not. South Korean voters were the heroes of the story. They voted out the people who had mismanaged the economy. Indonesians had to riot, you had to force out a longtime dictator. The procedures for democratic politics worked to make it possible to turn South Korea around. The procedures of dictatorship failed Indonesia at a moment of severe crisis. So too in Latin America. One of the striking things that occurred as you had a transition from dictatorship to democracy through the 1980s, when democratic politicians performed badly, particularly they were still doing so in the second half of the 1980s, they were thrown out of office in country after country. What is stunning, if we were having this conversation in 1989 and 1990, is that I could give you an exact forecast of virtually all Latin American elections. The incumbent party would lose for mismanaging the economy. This did not require a military coup. What it required was the voters understanding enough. They didn't have to be experts. They didn't have to know all the minutiae of the economy. What they had to know was what was clear to them. Those who were governing the country were governing the economy ineptly. And they kicked them out. So democracies can provide that mechanism better than dictatorships. They can get rid of the inept at much lower cost, with much less violence, quite effectively. Democracies also are much less likely to be facing revolutions, rebellions, or general labor union strikes that are called in order to get rid of dictatorships. Democracies, in fact, for the most part, have a better record throughout the region of coping much more effectively with protest. And the replacement of democracies, the replacement of dictatorships with democracies, in fact, lowered the level of violence, lowered the frequency of labor union general strikes throughout the region. A third general point, and I now want to illustrate some of them in the Latin American setting, third general point is that democracies are slow in making decisions, but that slowness, that deliberate pace, often makes for sounder, more effective, and more reliable policies. Because it means that it is not just me, the dictator, who seeks to command the economy to perform well, but it is that you and I and he and she and others need to agree to certain rules. And because we have an agreement, because it is not just one person dictating, it is more likely that today's rules will be tomorrow's rules. And one of the things that now it is very clear to understand the patterns of economic performance of many countries over time, not just Latin America, is that those that have stable, credible rules over time matter the most and are more effective in generating economic growth. Let me try to make the same point, but in a slightly different way. If you wanted to know something about an investment you or a friend of yours wanted to make in a particular country, you might want to speak to the president. You might want to speak to the central bank president. You may want to speak to the finance minister. But the person with whom you better be sure you speak is the leadership of the opposition. Because if you're not just interested in an investment that will last a few months or maybe 2 or 3 years, the life of this government, but if you're interested in an investment that will endure for a period of time, and in most democratic countries, after all, political parties do alternate, if you want to make sure that today's rules will be tomorrow's rules, that there may be some minor shifts here and there, but that in fact you can have some confidence that your property rights will be protected, that there will not be confiscatory taxation, that regulatory practices will be market conforming, only the opposition can guarantee the future. What democracies can do is that they bind markets by the consent of the government. And that is their key contribution to better economic policy. Let me now move from these more general remarks to some storytelling. The Olympic champion of misgovernment in Latin America in the 20th century was Argentina. Argentina is the one and only country I know that would rank in the 1920s on a variety of criteria, economic performance, politics, social circumstances, with the United States, Canada, and Western Europe, and managed to choose underdevelopment in the remainder of the 20th century. It chose to become poorer. Argentina is also a splendid example of equal opportunity and aptitude. Dictators and Democrats were equally awful. Political parties of the right, political parties of the left, political parties of the center, they all converged on one thing: if we can ruin the economy, we will. And Argentine performance in the 20th century, from the 1920s to the end of the 1980s, succeeded admirably in collectively ruining the country. When you reach the 1970s, Argentines believed that they needed dictators who performed no better. When they reached the end of the 1980s, the notion was, well, maybe dictators aren't really so good, but let's try to invent the next best thing. Under constitutional government, a very strong president. A very strong president who might be able to act as if he were a dictator. He just will not be killing and shooting and torturing people as much as dictators might. And so Carlos Menem is elected president of Argentina in 1989. At that time, the Argentine inflation rate was about 2,000, 3,000% per year. And President Menem courageously orders the economy to behave. And the inflation rate drops for a bit below 1,000% per year. But then, within a few weeks and a few months, it goes back up again. Argentina goes from hyperinflation to hyperinflation. Why was it that President Menem's economic policies, which in many respects were actually pretty good policies at the very beginning, did not work? Why is it that you went from hyperinflation to extremely high inflation back to hyperinflation? Because Argentines, having lived under so many different governments, under so many different circumstances, had no reason to believe their government. Indeed, the only rational behavior for any Argentine was to believe that the government would ruin the country yet again. And so to have the president say, I want things to be okay, particularly a president from the Peronista party, a party that had very much contributed to Argentina's ruin during the second half of the 20th century, carried no credibility. Beginning of 1991, President Menem appoints as his economy minister Domingo Cavallo. Cavallo and Menem, working together, had one key insight. The problem in the Argentine economy is not economic. The problem with the Argentine economy is political. That Argentines, with good reason, don't believe us. Just don't believe us. Cavallo had been central bank president under the military government and had, just like every other Argentine politician in the past, contributed to Argentina's ruin previous years. And so their insight, and it was a gamble that worked, their insight was the only way that we would be able to stop our economic decline and turn it around is to attempt to design a set of policies that would be credible, because we would be tying our hands. All that we would be pledging is that we will no longer be capable of ruining the economy. We're not going to be pledging that we will do this or that. What we're going to be pledging is we're not going to do what we've been doing all along. The most visible example to an ordinary Argentine of government success in ruining the economy was with regard to the exchange rate. The Argentine national currency had been devalued by astronomical quantities. Argentina is one of those countries that over the years has practiced, and it practiced repeatedly, had to be doing it every few years, to lop off the last 3 zeros of the currency. As you go an exchange rate of 1 million pesos to the dollar, you lop off a few zeros, and it doesn't look so bad. And then inflation went up again, and you lop off a few more zeros. So the exchange rate is a highly visible way to address this. And the procedures are therefore very straightforward, which was we will in fact cancel the ability of the government to affect the exchange rate. The Argentine national currency would be pegged to the dollar. Its relationship would be fixed and invariant, 1-to-1. The central bank will no longer have any authority to issue money unless it is backed by international reserves. If there is an exogenous shock, an international shock, an economic crisis, we will do nothing. The economy goes into a recession. Tied hands. It often goes by the label of a currency board. It is an arrangement, an economic arrangement that may not necessarily be a very good one for large countries for a variety of reasons. For Argentina, what it did was about the only thing the government could do. Credibility. But it's not just that we're not going to be issuing paper money on our say-so, and that now I'm going to indicate, I, the president, that I'm not going to do it, or I, the economy minister, that I'm not going to do it. So why should anybody believe me? So we're going to enact this policy as a law, called the convertibility law, to tie the hands of the president. The president cannot do it by decree. The economy minister, the central bank president, cannot do it by decree. By having it as an act of Congress, by having it as a commitment of a great many politicians from different political views, this finally turned it around. Argentina has had in the 1990s a number of serious difficulties. It is now in one of them, but it has had in the 1990s, despite these difficulties, the best growth rate in 100 years. Take another example, the replacement of General Pinochet in Chile. One of the new government, a coalition of Christian Democrats and Socialists that comes to power in 1990, almost exactly 9 years ago. One of the issues, one of the concerns that they had to deal with was, how is it that we can persuade the business community that the Socialists and Christian Democrats in the government will not now ruin the economy as Democrats have done in the past? And at the same time that we try to reassure the business community, how do we persuade them that we really do need to improve social circumstances because the Pinochet dictatorship neglected health care, because the Pinochet dictatorship neglected the quality of education. And even economists tell us that one of the best ways to ensure the future of economic growth is to invest in our young people today so that they would be able to produce more effectively for themselves and for our national community. The new government could have acted with its own majority in Congress, or it could even have attempted to govern by decree. But they understood that if you were trying to reassure others, just as in Argentina, you should not do it by the president acting alone as if the president were a dictator. You should not just do it because the finance minister seemed to be a very bright fellow. That the most effective way to be able to persuade people today that today's rules would endure tomorrow, that you were committed both to democratic principles and practices and to market principles and practices, is to reach out to the opposition, the former supporters of the military dictator, the people who had been oppressing you literally for 17 years, to reach out to them and to say, even though we, the democratic government today, could raise taxes with just our majority in Congress, we choose not to. We only want to raise taxes if you too go along. Because in that way, we would be signaling credibly to all Chileans and to international actors that we've put behind us both dictatorship and economic mismanagement. And so in 1991, a new tax code is enacted in Chile that raises taxes through a congressional supermajority. That is to say, a majority larger than necessary, a majority that includes parties of the government and parties of the opposition, and that commits those tax revenues to improve the quality of health care and education. And indeed, even in a relatively short period of time, 9 years is not a very long time, it is striking how the infant mortality rate has dropped in Chile. It is striking how mathematics scores of 5th graders have improved in public schools. You don't act alone. You understand that you need to give clear signals to markets that they would endure. And markets in the Chilean case understood it. Under the Pinochet dictatorship, very few international investors committed significant resources. International investments in Chile in the 1990s are many times higher than in the 1980s. Why? Because even international investors understand that if you can commit economic policies by the consent of the government, today's rules are more likely to endure tomorrow. Change countries, go from big South American countries to little Central American countries. El Salvador managed to go through extraordinarily destructive domestic and international warfare from the late 1970s to the beginning of the 1990s. It seemed to be a war without end, a war that was stunningly brutal throughout much of this period. Peace agreement is signed at the beginning of the 1990s, and today you have members of right-wing government heir to death squads and left-wing political parties heir to communist guerrilla insurgencies sitting in the National Assembly. In the mid-1990s, to focus just on economic questions, President of El Salvador, President Armando Calderón Sol, his term is now ending, began to behave almost as if he had never heard of President Menem's experience in Argentina. President Menem's experience in Argentina was, just to remind you, when Menem tried to right the wrongs of the economy all by himself, he got nowhere. When Menem reached out to include members of Congress and political parties of the opposition and began to govern not by decree but by laws, creating broad political coalitions, it worked, just as it worked in Chile. But in El Salvador, perhaps because it's too far north, who knows, President Calderón Sol began to believe that he could right the wrongs of the Salvadoran economy all by himself, governing by decree. And this included major acts like the privatization of the telecommunications company. Shortly after he did this, there are legislative elections, and the parties of the left win a majority in the assembly. One of the first steps that they undertake is to nullify the president's decree. This is what you expect when a president acts as if he were a dictator, because there is no attempt to try to establish means and procedures for today's rules to persist tomorrow. What President Calderón Sol was able to learn, fortunately, quickly, both for himself and for his country, is what President Menem had first learned, which is, we can do this. Maybe not exactly the way that I, all by myself, would have preferred, but we can do it in ways that meet all our objectives and have one additional gain: the greater certainty, the greater credibility that the measures we adopt today will be able to endure. And so there is political negotiation. This is politicians at their best. There is some give and take. There is some deal making. And the Salvadoran National Assembly, by a supermajority, including parties of the government and parties of the opposition, enacts a privatization law that covers a wide variety of state enterprises and permits the privatization of the telecommunications company to go forward, and the president signs it. And El Salvador, through the course of the 1990s, is Central America's best economic performer. Those of you who follow the news, and all of you are here because you do probably know that Brazil has had a very tough time in the last couple of months, the beginning of 1999. Let me try to illustrate some of these propositions that I've been discussing with regard to Brazil's financial crisis, particularly Brazil's financial crisis starting a little bit earlier. Namely, as I mentioned in a slightly different context a few minutes ago, in mid-1997, the financial crisis breaks out in East Asia, Thailand, South Korea, Malaysia, Indonesia. And there is worldwide concern, understandably, that a variety of so-called emerging markets, countries in East Asia and in Latin America, would not be able to meet their international financial obligations. Stock markets crash in a number of these countries and the like. How was it that Brazil responded to the fear of contamination, to the fear that the financial panic that began in East and Southeast Asia would spread to Brazil? It responded first by President of Brazil, Fernando Henrique Cardoso, adopting a number of important economic measures by decree. Again, as if he had learned nothing from President Menem, as if he had learned nothing from President Calderon in El Salvador. The initial response in the Brazilian stock market and Brazilian currency was markets continued to drop, fear that Brazil would not be able to respond effectively to the crisis in East Asia, panic began to spread. But then President Cardoso understood, fortunately for him and for his country, quickly, that there was a better way to do this. And so he goes to the Brazilian Congress with the same set of measures that he had just enacted by decrees, to get them enacted through legislation that would commit the parties of the government and the parties of the opposition. Once it is enacted by Congress, the Brazilian stock market stabilizes, as does the currency, because both Brazilians and foreigners with a stake in the Brazilian economy came to understand that credible policies have been enacted because the president had not been acting alone. Because in fact, the political foundations for sounder management of the Brazilian economy had been set in place, and Brazil made it through this period in 1997 through the first half of 1998. In August of 1998, there's a Russian financial panic. And the very same question, of course, is posed once again: how will Brazil respond to this? And by this time, Brazil is in the midst of a presidential election with President Cardoso running for re-election. And there is the same drop in the stock market, the same assault on the Brazilian national currency. What the president does is he goes on national television and he gives a transparent, frank, Churchillian speech that says, if you re-elect me, the economic policies that I, as president of Brazil, would need to enact will give us nothing but toil, tears, and sweat. Making it very, very clear what was the nature of the problem, what were the measures that needed to be adopted, and what was the kind of political support that he wanted. Vote for me only if you're prepared for this likely environment. And he was re-elected overwhelmingly. In Brazil, as in the example that I cited you of South Korea, the voters are heroes of many of these things. And then what happened? Then, in an attempt at trying to prevent a Brazilian financial panic, the International Monetary Fund, the United States government, and others do something that sounded like an excellent idea at the time. They created a large pot of money to help Brazil defend its economic policies, contingent on the Brazilian Congress adopting additional measures. Brazilian members of Congress, however, were given almost no information by the IMF, by the US government, by the Brazilian government. The only information that they got was, hey, we're off the hook. There's all this money out there. So they defeated the measures that the president, on his own say-so, without consulting members of Congress, had committed to undertaking. And a variety of other instances happened. The state governor of the state of Minas Gerais, a former president of Brazil, refused to pay his financial obligations to the federal government, and the Brazilian panic began. Let me then conclude on this point. It is not that democracy guarantees you good economic policy. That's foolish. We know that many democratic governments behave badly. What I've tried to illustrate is that democracies can perform very well in the management of the economy. That many Latin American democracies in the 1990s have performed very well in the management of the economy. That the reasons why democracies can and do perform well are not just good luck of a fine alignment of the stars or talented finance ministers or bright presidents. The reason democracies can and do perform better is directly connected to essential features of democratic practices and institutions. The voters know when to turn out a bad politician and when to re-elect a good one. The more credible policies are those not enacted by decree, but those enacted by the creation of wide political coalitions that use the relation between President and Congress, that enact laws, not decrees, not dictatorial impositions. And that when presidents fail to tend to the need to build political support in Congress, as happened in Brazil in late 1998 and early 1999, when international financial institutions or the U.S. government believe that they just need to talk to one man, the President of Brazil, and not take into account the important role of members of Congress, and fail to understand that it is through democratic procedures that Brazil had avoided the two previous potential panics, that it is at the neglect of the need to build the commitments and the consent of the government that democracies can and have performed very badly. What is interesting as the century closes in Latin America is that the means for better economic performance are clear, that politicians can in fact now learn from their own experience and from each other, that there are procedures that have worked again and again in very different countries, that those who have employed effectively the procedures of constitutional government and who have leveled with the voters and have been transparent, have been able to create the political support to address the economic problems that they fail to turn, that they face, to turn their countries around and to establish credible rules for the future. And those who have not taken the procedures of democratic politics seriously are also the economic mismanagers. The continent faces a clear choice. It should amaze us that many politicians still choose stupidity, but it should cheer us. It should cheer us that most have in fact performed admirably well, and that Latin America's performance both on the grounds of democracy and markets in the 1990s has been the best in more than a generation. Now we have time for some questions. Yes.
In the framework of the propositions that you stated and the principles, how would you rate Fujimori in Peru?
How would I rate President Fujimori in Peru? This is a good example of someone who, faced with very severe problems upon his election in 1990, acted intelligently, courageously, and for a period of time with the active participation of Congress. A Congress where the political parties of the opposition had a majority. What is interesting about Peru in the period between 1990 and 1992 is that it fits exactly the set of arguments that I have indicated. That when you have a president who is working with Congress, and even better, a Congress controlled by the opposition, you can enact a wide variety of laws that help to turn the country around. What occurred was that President Fujimori became impatient. And even though Congress approved more than 3/4 of all the bills he submitted and enacted them into law, he didn't think that was enough. And so he calls upon the military and leads a coup that dissolves Congress and the courts, bans a number of political parties. And what one observes in Peru in the 1990s is, in terms of economic performance, is a number of things. One is the positive, the salutary effect of the economic policies established between 1990 and 1992 with the participation of President and Congress. Those policies worked, and Peru's economic performance in the 1990s is better than before. Peru turned around not after Fujimori's coup, but before, and that's important to remember. Peru was able to face up to major insurgency and terrorism from which it had been suffering, not because of massive violations of human rights and military force, although they have occurred as well, but in the key actions through effective, old-fashioned, good police work by civilian police. So it is clear that Peru turns around, but it's important to figure out how it did. What are the main problems in Peru in the 1990s with regard to economic policy? Well, I think there are basically two. One is volatility. Peru really has had a great many ups and downs, more than most other countries to which it would like to compare itself and which had adopted similar policies. And great uncertainty, which is part of the explanation for volatility, about what will happen when Fujimori is no longer there. Why the uncertainty? Because Fujimori has not built political parties. Fujimori has a congerie of people whom he works with and discards. He is not a coalition builder. He's not an institution builder. And in fact, there is genuine reason for concern about what Peruvian economic policies would be after President Fujimori, because he chose not to behave as I've been describing. He chose to believe that he could decree the performance of the economy, and there is no guarantee at all, not even a likelihood, that today's rules will be tomorrow's rules in Peru. That's what democratic regimes can do effectively, and that's what he did between 1990 and 1992, but not since 1992. Yes?
Are there any indications that Brazil is attempting to recover?
Brazil is attempting to recover. Whether it will recover is a little less clear. Frightened by the panic, the Brazilian Congress turned around and began to enact a number of the bills that it had defeated only a few weeks earlier. The problem is that whereas that kind of responsible behavior helps to prevent panics, once a panic gets underway, it's much more difficult to break, and costs incurred by the fact of the panic that already has taken place are very hard to overcome. The panic seems to have subsided. This doesn't mean that the economy has stabilized, but the sort of the dramatic collapse seems to have come to an end. The process of economic reform has not picked up sufficient speed. The economic recession that is a consequence of the panic is just beginning. That economic recession, by virtue of the relatively close trade and other economic relations, is bound to spread, has begun to spread to Argentina and to Uruguay and to Paraguay. So it is a process of contamination that at best will give these four countries an economic recession during the balance of 1999, a rather more severe one for Brazil perhaps than for its neighbors. Whether there will be sufficient economic reform in relations between President and Congress, it remains to be seen. The major legislative season in Brazil is just getting going now. The sort of summer carnival is over. Now is the time when this will take place. So the next 3 months or so will, better than the last 3 months, enable you and me and the rest of us to be able to gauge the answer to your good question. I am sure that the comment is excellent, and so is the question. Economists, and not just economists, often use an expression called moral hazard. And what I described very briefly in terms of what I think with the best of intentions, the IMF and the US government and many other governments and international institutions did to try to help Brazil late in 1998, illustrates one of these problems, which is, to put it in the most straightforward terms, you have this big pot of money, and the Brazilian members of Congress felt off the hook. You know, we don't need to do anything. If there is an assault on our national currency or we have a problem, the money is not going to come from Brazilian taxpayers, the money is going to come from US taxpayers, the money is going to come from somewhere else. On the other hand, the idea of creating this kind of cushion to help a Brazilian government that twice in the preceding 12 months had performed so well seemed very sensible. I mean, Brazilian President, Congress, others, did exactly the right thing in mid-1997 in response to the East Asian financial crisis. The President did exactly the right thing, running for re-election and being very frank with the public after the Russian financial panic. So this looked like a good bunch of people who would live up to their word. So I can understand why it seemed like a very good decision at the time. My guess would be at present that not that there should not be some attempts to help governments that had been performing well, as Brazil had through 2 recent episodes, but to take more seriously the proposition that even the US government and even the IMF, if it expects the government of Brazil to act, it can't just talk to the president of Brazil. It needs to include, you know, those who chair the finance committees in Congress. It needs to include leaders of the opposition. What is noteworthy is that when the US government negotiates internationally, characteristically, the president includes leaders of Congress, leaders of the opposition. A normal way for the United States to negotiate an international trade treaty is, you better do this, otherwise the crazies in Congress are going to do something else, and to make it credible, they would bring some crazy senator or some crazy representative to demonstrate them. These are normal bargaining tactics. So if the United States bargains internationally by making use of its democratic procedures, its constitutional government, the fact that there's a powerful Congress, it ought to understand that if it expects the Brazilian government, not just the president of Brazil, to behave responsibly, that that's the way to operate. So my instinct, and it's nothing better than that, is that it might have worked better if the negotiations between the international community and the Brazilian government had been with the Brazilian government, not just with the Brazilian president. And that's what, if I were rerunning history again, I would have attempted. Yes, in the back.
What has been the effect of NAFTA on the economies of those?
The effect of NAFTA on the economies of these countries. NAFTA has 3 members, Canada, the United States, and Mexico. But NAFTA has indirect effects on others. NAFTA is probably the principal explanation why the Mexican financial panic of late 1994 and early 1995 was short-lived. Previous time Mexico had a severe financial panic, 1982-83, it took the remainder of the 1980s for Mexico to recover. The panic of late 94, early 95 was over within 1 year, and the Mexican economy rebounded very well. The Mexican economy performed well in 1997, performed well in 1998. In fact, the Mexican economy had not performed this well since the 1960s. So if we want to understand why the money that the United States loaned to Mexico to make it through the 94-95 financial panic was repaid with interest very quickly, ahead of schedule, the answer is NAFTA. NAFTA has, however, two other kinds of effects. NAFTA, in my view, has been net very positive for Mexico, the United States, and Canada. It has two other kinds of effects that are costs. This doesn't mean that the costs exceed the benefits, but it's important to recognize the costs. There are costs in all three participating countries to individual firms, to individual factories and plants, and to communities where factories, plants, firms shut down, workers lose their jobs, and the effects of it. Those are very serious costs that none of the countries has addressed effectively enough. There's not enough assistance to help those who lose their jobs as a result of one of these trade effects. Second consequence is for the countries of Central America and the Caribbean that used to export light manufactures, apparel, textiles, shoes, and the like to the United States. Those businesses have now displaced, understandably, to Mexico. And so there is a severe economic problem in countries like the Dominican Republic or El Salvador. President Clinton yesterday in El Salvador pledged that the United States would try to do something about this collateral damage of NAFTA. Should have done something long ago. It'd be good if it does something now. There are some things that can be done, but that the NAFTA partners have not. So there are some real costs within each of the three NAFTA members, and there are also some real costs for some very poor countries that have been displaced by Mexico's newly gained advantages in this context. You told me I'm supposed to end at noon, and I think this is noon, so thank you.